In this section, we are going to cover the concept of AWS IoT Thing. The AWS IoT Thing is a digital representation of a physical or virtual device. So, what are those devices? A physical device might be, for instance, a robotic arm that we want to model in AWS in order to remotely monitor and manage that piece of equipment. We use virtual devices to describe very complex objects. For instance, a rocket engine is a fairly complex device. That's why we decompose it to a number of virtual devices and represent every single one of those devices as an IoT thing in our AWS Thing registry. Finally, we can model our application as an IoT thing, in cases when we want that application to communicate with other devices of our system the same way as devices do. So that is very high-level overview of the concept of the IoT thing. Let's go to the AWS console to go into details. I'm logged into AWS Web Console. In order to find IoT things, we need to go to the AWS IoT Core service, which is the main service of AWS in the IoT domain. Go to the search and type IoT Core. This is the service we're looking for. We can find our IoT things under Manage, All Devices, Things. As you can see, I do not have anything created, so let's create one together and review its properties. We will create a single thing for demonstration purposes and click Next. Those are the properties that describe our IoT thing, and those are very important because IoT thing represents a physical device, and the more we know about that physical device from the AWS perspective, the better we can manage the fleet of our devices. The only mandatory property of an IoT thing is the thing name. It needs to be unique and can contain only letters, numbers, hyphens, colons, and underscores. So you need to prepare the naming convention that meets those conditions. I will call my thing the thing 001. Now we can fill the additional configuration that will allow us to store more data about this specific thing that represents our device. The first is the thing type. We will go into details about the thing type in the next section, but now I will give you the very high-level overview of this concept. A thing type allows us to store common attributes for devices of the same type. So, for instance, we've got 3 temperature sensor devices, and all of those devices can be described by the same set of attributes. In that case, we want to use a thing type to ensure that we use the consistent set of attributes describing the same type of devices. Then we've got the attributes themselves. So we can store metadata that describe our IoT thing as attributes. And attribute is essentially a key value pair, where the key represents some specific feature of our device and value is the actual content of that feature. So, for instance, we can use the hardware version as the key of our attribute. And let's say for that specific device that is represented by this IoT thing, the hardware version is 1.0. Storing the hardware version as the attribute of IoT thing is extremely important, because the hardware itself defines the ways that we can interact with our thing, and it can limit the number of actions that we want to invoke for that specific device. So that's why I always recommend to store the hardware version as one of the attributes. Let's add additional attribute, and we can add the owner. So as you can see, the thing attributes not only describe the hardware characteristics of the represented devices, but they can also describe some business concepts related to that specific thing. In our case, that might be the owner. Let's go further. We've got the thing group, and the thing group is a concept that I will describe in a future section, but let's review the very high level overview. The thing group allows for logical grouping of our devices, and we can leverage that for ease of maintenance. So we can group various devices represented by various IoT things of the same of various types as a single thing group. And thing group itself got attributes, so we can add additional description to the thing group and to the IoT things that are grouped by that specific group. This way we've got more insights about the actual devices represented by those things grouped by this specific thing group. Going further, we've got the billing group, and the purpose of billing group is the cost allocation, and by cost I mean the AWS infrastructure cost generated by those specific devices represented as those things grouped by this billing group. Going further, we've got packages and versions, so we can use those properties to store the packages and versions installed on those specific devices. This way we can track the firmware and the additional applications that we installed, for instance, for our small smart lamp remotely, and we've got all of those details stored as the property of the IoT thing that is accessible from the AWS perspective. Finally, we've got a device shadow, and device shadow is a bit more complex topic that I will cover in our next meeting regarding this specific IoT thing.